are going to go ahead and get started tonight. Cab Nation and community guests, we welcome you to Walsh University tonight in honor of both our inaugural Human Dignity Week as well as Stalking Awareness Month. My name is Joy Robb, and I serve as the Director of Prevention, Education, and Programming here at Walsh, as well as the Project Director for Walsh's Federal Office on Violence Against Women Grant Award. Our grant project, you've probably seen the name around a lot, is called the Cavalier Safeguard Initiative and has been focused on stalking education this year through our Know It, Name It, Stop It campaign. It has been instrumental in bringing more awareness to this serious crime on our campus through events like the one we are hosting this evening. Before we move forward, I want to give a special thank you to Student Affairs, Counseling Services, Prevention, Education, and Programming, Sodexo, and Diamond Mission, one of our student organizations, for helping to co-sponsor and donate to tonight's event. I also want to thank our president, Dr. Tim Collins, for joining us for this meaningful presentation. Dr. Collins has played a critical role in enhancing campus safety efforts at Walsh over the past few years since he's arrived. Tonight, we are thrilled to host one of the nation's leading speakers on this crime, Debbie Riddle, who brings with her an impressive understanding of the complexities of stalking, as well as her sister's heartbreaking story, which we will learn about shortly. I do want to share that Ms. Riddle has generously given Walsh permission to record tonight's presentation, and we will be sharing a copy of it with our campus community at a later time. We do want to offer a warning that the subject matter we will be discussing may be sensitive or challenging for some to process or hear. Please know that we do have a victim advocate who is present this evening from our local Rape Crisis Center, Compass, should anyone need to speak confidentially with a professional during or after this presentation. She is located in the back of the room. She's actually outside of the doors right now, but she will be in the back of the room, center aisle, and she will be available at the resource table outside of those main doors again immediately following Ms. Riddle's presentation. Additionally, I do want to note that explicit language may be used throughout tonight's presentation, in an effort to just transparently really talk about the severity of the crime and what really has happened in Peggy's story. We know that each person has been fearfully and wonderfully made in the image of God, and within us all exists an innate dignity that cannot be stripped away. Try as some might to steal it. Tonight we will hear about one such story of a young woman whose human dignity was blatantly disregarded. Please join me as we welcome Debbie Riddle to the floor on the eve of the 20th anniversary of her sister's death to lead us in her presentation titled Peggy's Story. Over the past 16 years, Debbie Riddle has joined forces with the National Center for Victims of Crime and the Stalking Resource Center, Aaron Brockovich, Lifetime Television, and nationally recognized stalking expert Mark Wynn to spread awareness of this serious crime. She has spoken at a congressional briefing in Washington, D.C. to request recognition of January as Stalking Awareness Month, and at the 10-year anniversary of the Violence Against Women Act conference alongside Senator Orrin Hatch and Senator Joe Biden. She co-produced a stalking awareness training video that is currently used across the United States to train all divisions of our criminal justice system, as well as forensic nurses, victims advocates, and college students, faculty, and administrative populations. Debbie, thank you for being here tonight.
Thank you. Can you all hear me? Okay, good. When we were testing technology earlier, I told the story about how I was telling my girls that I go out speaking and I have to be wired up with a mic, and they were like, "Ooh, why do you have to have a mic? You're so loud." So that's the opinion of my girls about myself. Before we get started this evening, I want to give you a little bit of background about who I am, where I came from, and how I got to be here today. Born and raised in Northeast Ohio, little town of Poland, oldest of 4 children. I went to Ohio University with dreams of becoming a doctor. So about 2 quarters into that, I found out that chemistry and I were never, ever, ever going to be friends. So I ditched the medical profession and hung out in the art building and graduated with a degree in graphic design. I had dreams of working in advertising, so I basically threw my resume into Pittsburgh and into Cleveland. Those were Two cities that I've always wanted to be a part of, not so much Pittsburgh, because I don't know if I could have ever been a Pittsburgh Steelers fan. I know my dad would have never, ever allowed that. But I got a job in Cleveland. I spent about 4 years working at an ad agency. I left there. I spent another 8 years working at a really great creative shop. It was work hard, play harder, probably the best 8 years of my life. But advertising was not a family-friendly environment for me. I just got married. I had 2 young children. So when I was at work, I was worried about my girls. And when I was at home, I was worried about work. So I decided I'm going to leave the advertising business. I'm going to start a freelance business. I just wanted to keep my foot in the door, doing what I loved, and to be accessible to my girls. So I started a freelance business when my girls were probably kindergarten and 2. And I kept saying, I'm going to hold out as long as I can. I want to be at home with them at least until they get to high school. And the magic of that was I got to do it for 18 years. I did it until my youngest was a sophomore in high school. And about 6 years ago, we relocated to North Carolina. We lived just outside of Raleigh. And I finally went back to work. I took a job with the North Carolina Department of Public Safety and one of the 2 graphic designers. Love what I do, but how did a graphic designer from a small town in Ohio get to be a stalking expert? I wish to God I didn't know what I know today. But I will tell you this, I feel like I was the right person to be in the right place at the right time, to be able to obtain this information and to deliver it to all of you. What we know about stalking, we talked about human dignity earlier. These stalking victims are stripped of every ounce of human dignity. They are so traumatized that you cannot get a stalking victim to come up here and stand in front of an audience like this and tell their story. So that's where I come in. I am able to stand in front of you this evening and share not only one, but 2 personal stories about how stalking has touched my life. Before we get into this, into the personal story, put your hand up if you know what stalking is. Just raise it. If somebody was to come up to you on the street and say, "What is stalking? Could you explain it?" Put your hand up high and leave it there. Stalking. What is the definition of it? Keep your hands up. Stalking is a pattern of behavior directed at a specific person to cause a reasonable person to feel fear. Keep your hand up high if you knew exactly that was the definition. So we got some good people in this room. But do you see where the problem lies? Do you see how many hands went down when I read that definition? There is a huge disconnect of what stalking truly is and what we have in our mind. We listen to music about stalking. The Police, Every Breath You Take. That's a stalking song. There are shows on Netflix. Who Watches You? It's a stalking show. And oftentimes what we see happening in our world is that they are romanticizing stalking. So these young girls are equating stalking with love and romance. It's not. It is the furthest thing from love. When we're looking at stalking cases, we want to pay attention to context. Context is extremely, extremely critical. We have to think about these victims because what they might be afraid of, that might not mean anything to us at all. Roses, flowers, those are signs of affection and love. But to a victim, they might be terrified when they come home one evening and there's flowers on the doorstep. Because their stalker told them, the day I leave you flowers on your doorstep is the day I'm going to kill you. So context is extremely, extremely critical when we're dealing with stalking cases. Oftentimes, what stalkers will do will take non-criminal behavior and criminalize it. Is it a crime to text somebody? Is it a crime to text them 50 times a day? Is it a crime to walk back and forth in front of someone's classroom while they're in a classroom trying to study? That's not a crime at all, but what they're doing is inducing fear. Oftentimes, stalking is not a one-off. We cannot look at it as an isolated incident. You have to step back and look at all the different tactics that these stalkers are using to induce fear into their victims. So, non-criminal behavior. There was a victim that had a stalker. She moved out of her town, out of her state, across the country, where she was hoping to God that her stalker wasn't going to find her. She walks out one morning and there's a hot cup of coffee sitting on her car dash. She freaks out and she calls the police. And the police show up and they have no idea, why is this cup of coffee sitting on your dashboard so terrifying? The name on the coffee cup was the pet name that her stalker had called her. He was sending her a very clear message that he knew where she was now living. So you see, while that's not criminal behavior, they're criminalizing it by inducing fear into their victim. It is a crime. It's a crime in all 50 states. Oftentimes, people don't understand this. They don't think that stalking is that big of a deal. It is a crime, without a doubt. So, who are our stalkers? Women are more likely to experience stalking than men. We also see in the reported cases that most of the stalkers are men. That is not to say that men are not stalking victims, because they are. The reporting of men being stalking victims is much, much lower than women reporting. Men often stalk men, and women often stalk women. But the majority is what we're seeing here. The majority of the victims do know their offenders, and what we're seeing nowadays is the majority of our stalking population is between the ages of 18 and 24. That is our college campus. How easy is it to be stalked as a college student? Do you think it's easy? Pretty. Is your schedule pretty predictable? If you're an athlete, are your practices pretty much regimented at same time, same location? You live in a residence hall? It's kind of hard to change that. I met a mom several years ago who had a daughter at the University of Akron, and she had broken up with her boyfriend, and he had become her stalker. And she wanted nothing to do with him and tried to ride out the rest of her freshman year, went home for the summer, and came back to campus in the fall. And when she arrived on campus, got to her dorm, her stalker was now her RA. So now what's she gonna do? She left school because that man was making her life so incredibly miserable. Again, is it a crime that he became an RA? Absolutely not. He knew what he was doing, though. He wanted to be in her face, on her radar 24/7, and that's what it would have been like of her walking into that dorm room every single day. The victim-offender relationship. Back in the 70s and 80s, when you heard the term stalker, we were mainly thinking of Hollywood. Some star being stalked by someone unknown. But today what we're seeing is a rise on intimate partner stalking. So it's either a current intimate partner or a past intimate partner. And oftentimes we see the stalking begin and escalate when that person decides to leave that abusive relationship. Why do they stalk? These stalking behaviors and these habits are not, like I said, they're not based on love. They are based on power and control. And when that offender loses the power and control that he had over his victim, then the stalking will begin, trying to reinsert himself into that relationship. Rapists. There was a group of men who were all convicted rapists, and this gentleman had studied them and asked them questions, wrote down results, and all of them admitted, heck yes, I stalk my victim. How else could I keep track of my victim's habit if I wasn't stalking them? So the SLY framework. These are a smidgen of all the different types of tactics that stalkers will use to keep track, harass, track down their victims. Surveillance, life invasion, interference, and intimidation. When we get into my sister's case and we talk about it, come back to this list and think about all the different tactics that this gentleman used to harass my sister. So surveillance, following, watching, waiting, obtaining information about the victim, proxy stalking. If I'm the stalker and I can't get to my victim, what I'm going to do is use someone else to stalk my victim. If by chance I get put in jail for stalking, I'm going to have somebody else on the outside go and stalk my victim for me. Life invasion, basically invading your life, showing up unannounced, showing up unwanted, property invasion, public humiliation. Interference, ruining one's reputation, trying to keep them from leaving. Road rage, my sister experienced this when she left the police department. This young man tried to run her off the road. A physical or a sexual attack. And if they can't get to the stalker, or if they can't get to the victim, what they'll do oftentimes is find a pet. I worked with a young man whose sister was being stalked. And it's not that they weren't taking seriously, they really didn't know what to do about this gentleman. Kept driving by the house, laying on the horn, pulling in the driveway, flicking his brights at the house, and really, it was just to terrify his sister. And because the family wasn't reacting and they hadn't called the police department, he got into the rabbit cage one night. This was his sister's pet, and slaughtered the rabbit and bundled it up and shoved it in the mailbox. So sending a very clear message to that victim that maybe someday this might possibly be you. Intimidation. Property damage, we're going to talk about that. Forced confrontation, threatening to kill themselves or to harm others. I have worked with several victims, several young girls that stay in these abusive relationships because he said he's going to kill himself if I leave. That is a tactic to keep that victim close by and to not leave. And these young girls will often say, I can fix him, but they can't. Pattern of behavior. 2/3 of stalkers pursue their victim at least once per week. My sister stalker pursued her daily. And if not one time a day, several times a day, and by using different tactics. 78% of stalkers use more than one means of approach. All the different things that we just talked about, all the different things that they will try. Technology has made it so much easier to stalk. You can stalk from the comfort of your own home. I feel like back in the day you had to pull out a phone book, look up an address, get in your car to drive, maybe pick up some dead flowers, then you had to deliver them to that person's house. It's just easier. So we are in constant contact with everybody in our world. And don't we put things out there on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram, Find My Friends, all of this information that's out there. Imagine being a stalking victim and having to try to cover your tracks and to not check into places and to not say who you're with. That's an awful lot of work for a victim to do. Weapons used to harm or threaten victims in about 20% of the cases. The weapon of choice is a knife. Impact on victims. The number one thing that we're talking about is they just don't know what's going to happen next. They are constantly surveilling their surroundings, always looking over their shoulder, checking windows, checking doors, looking behind them. They just don't know what their offender is going to do next, so they are always on guard. It's hypervigilance. Bodily harm, behavior that will never stop, and very common is losing one's mind. We've worked with victims who haven't come forward because they literally think they're going crazy. The offender has made them feel so unsupported, so isolated. So oftentimes, in their mind, they talk themselves into thinking, well, maybe this is just all in my mind. Maybe I'm making it more of a big deal than what it really is. And oftentimes, that's what the stalker wants you to do, is to minimize the behavior. Because when the victim minimizes the behavior, the stalker will maximize on what they're going to do next. Safety. The stalking log is one of the best tools that we can get into the hands of stalking victims. Imagine being a stalking victim and you've got someone driving by, then you have someone slashing your tires, and then you have someone scratching your paint on your car, and then you have someone kill your cat, and then someone killed all the flowers, and then someone harassed your brother at a basketball game. And you have all of these things that are going on. And then you decide you want to go talk to somebody. Are you going to have a complete clear list in your mind when you decide to talk to someone? It's going to be so scrambled. Oftentimes these stalking victims feel like they don't have any proof. It's not like a domestic violence victim where they can walk in with a broken arm or a black eye or a split lip. They walk in and say, like, this guy's been bothering me. He's been coming by my house. He's been calling me. Look at my cell phone. This stalking log is a great tool to have. Because for every incident that happens, you can write it down. Time, date. Did you call law enforcement? If you called law enforcement, what officer did you talk to? What's his badge number? What time was it? Where did this happen? So when a stalking victim finally feels comfortable enough to come forward and talk to somebody, they have this. They now have proof in their hands. So things we want to consider. First and foremost, trust what the victim is saying. Listen to them. Believe what they are saying. Support them. Get them to a source, maybe here on campus. Get them to a source where they can talk to somebody. Consider what the stalker might do next, considering all the behavior that's been going on. Anticipate the stalker's reaction. We also have to balance safety with freedom. We have to understand that sometimes these victims, when we tell them, you just need to leave, they may not leave, because that's where they feel safest. They don't want to rock the boat. So they're going to stay exactly where they're at to keep things status quo. So we really, really have to understand what the victims are saying and support them in their decisions. This is my information. This is what I love to do best. The girl that I hike with in North Carolina, we go on so many adventures. So if you have any backpacking or hiking tips at the end, come and talk to me about those. But the reason why I'm putting this up here, if you have any questions or concerns, or 3 weeks from now you think of something and you want to reach out to me, shoot me an email. This is my sister. And this is who I like talking about the best. Because you will walk away from this presentation with a completely different perspective of what the crime of stalking is. Peggy was 28 years old when she met her stalker. She had lived in Italy for a while, came back to the United States, ended up in Albuquerque, New Mexico. She already had her undergraduate degree from Kent State, and she decided she wanted to go on to medical school. So she decided while she was out in Albuquerque, she was going to take some classes, and on that campus, she met her stalker. Now, this man was average looking man. He was very nice to her, very kind. You know, from what I remember talking to Peggy, he had asked her out to dinner, they had gone to some movies, and that was about all I knew about him. And this was in the fall of 1998. So I think most of the people in the room can't even imagine this, but no smartphone, no Google. It was AOL dial-up. You couldn't use your telephone when you were on the internet. So it was, I don't understand. I mean, back in the day, I'm like, how did we find people? It wasn't as easy. We didn't have Google. So Peggy comes back from Albuquerque to Ohio to spend Christmas with us. And she's home for a few days, and a couple days before New Year's, the doorbell rings. I answer the door, and there's a guy standing on my mother's front porch with a big suitcase. No idea who he is. Peggy comes down the stairs, and I'm literally standing between Peggy and this guy. And he said, "Oh, hey, I'm here to surprise you for the holidays." It's like, who the hell is this? The look on my sister's face was not one of surprise. It was she was a little shocked. I cannot say this enough. You know your gut? You know when they talk about that gut feeling? Trust your gut. Because in that moment, when I was standing between her and him, I had a bad feeling about him. And like I said, he didn't look like an axe murderer. He's just an average looking guy, standing on the front porch with a suitcase. There was something about him that I just didn't like. And I think the one thing that bothered me the most was, how the hell did you find out where my mother lived? Who invited you here? So he spent a few days during the holidays with us, and it was awful. He inserted himself into our families. He was overbearing. He was a little foul. My other sister had a New Year's Eve party, and at that party he said to her, "Ooh, it looks like I picked the wrong sister to sleep with." Again, dude, who the hell are you? You've been in our circle for a few days. We don't like you. So Peggy goes back to Albuquerque. He goes back to Albuquerque, and now we find out that they're living together. And I don't hear much from Peggy other than like, oh, you know, we did this, or we went skiing, or we went to the lake. Very, very, very superficial things. Now, my other sister, who is closer in age, had maybe a little bit deeper conversations with Peggy and what was going on. And my other sister did not like him at all. Again, go back to that trust your gut. We just had a bad feeling about him. And right before December of '99, Peggy announces that she's going to Germany to meet Patrick's mother. And my sister said, "Is no one gonna believe me about this guy until Peggy comes home in a body bag?" That's how intuitive my sister was with this guy. And knowing him just for a very few days. Peggy goes to Germany, she comes home, she's fine. They continue their relationship, they continue to live together. I was getting a little bit more out of Peggy. Like, what do you and your husband fight about? Does your husband get mad when you go out? Does he criticize the way you dress? And I'm thinking, no, no, and no, but what is going on in your life that you're asking me these questions? People, these are all red flags in dangerous, toxic relationships. All of them that are appearing, that are coming up. Why can't she go out with friends? Why can't she dress the way she wants to? Why does he belittle her? All red flags, all of them. So we had a family vacation planned down at the Outer Banks in North Carolina. Very small, sleepy town, not a whole lot going on. Peggy's to join us on vacation. Well, guess what? All of a sudden, he's coming with her and he's bringing his young daughter from a previous marriage. That was 7 days of hell. Again, I never looked at him as my sister's boyfriend or my sister's partner, more like her supervisor. She wasn't allowed to do things with her sisters and her mother. She wasn't allowed to go off without him. She wasn't allowed to be on the beach without him. She wasn't allowed to go meet a friend from high school without him. It was miserable, absolutely miserable that he was on that vacation with us. He also brought a gun. I said, why do you have a gun down? There's nothing down here. Unless you're shooting fish, you don't need a gun. Well, just in case. There wasn't a chance in hell that my young girls were going to that condo, which was a little bit devastating for them because this was their Aunt Peggy. This was the fun aunt. And she couldn't be the fun aunt because he was involved. So their relationship continues. It's not good. I asked her a couple times, why isn't she leaving? And again, I didn't understand back then why she couldn't leave. I just kept saying, you need to leave. You need to get out of this relationship. He's a bad guy. He's bad for you, and you're not this person anymore. You're not fun. You're miserable. But she couldn't leave him. There was one small moment in time when my other sister was vacationing in Vegas and said to Peggy, come out and spend a couple days with us. And Peggy got to the airport and couldn't get on the airplane. She spent the afternoon vomiting because she is terrified. She's terrified of what's going to happen to her if she walks away from this relationship. And she's not telling any of us what's going on. But like I said, my sister and I are starting to read between the lines of some of these messages she's sending us. So in November of 2001, Peggy was to come back to Cleveland, Ohio for a wedding. It was her childhood friend's wedding. And Patrick was not invited. He was not to be at that wedding. And again, reinserted himself into this situation and invited himself and made my sister change hotels because she was not staying with her family. That was the last time I laid eyes on him. And I had one brief conversation with him where I said something a little snarky, and the look he gave me, it's like, I'm gonna kill you. And I thought, I hope to God I never, ever have to see him again. So they left after that wedding. They went back to Albuquerque, and in January of 2002, Peggy called me and said, I left him, but now guess what? He's stalking me. And I thought I had the perfect answer for her. I'm like, I got this. When I was in college, I met somebody, and shortly after graduating, he was possessive, creepy, wanted to get married, up in my business 24/7. I had just gotten my first job. He was calling the office all the time. He was running the tapes out on my answering machine. I had no idea what this was all about. And after I broke up with him, still persisted with the calling and the showing up. And I said to a good friend who was on the police force, I was explaining this to him, and he said, do you know what's happening to you? I go, no, but whatever it is, I want it to stop. And he said, you're being stalked. 1989, I'm like, isn't stalking for Hollywood? I don't understand what this is all about. Get an order of protection and he will never ever bother you again. So I'm like, all right, go to the police station, fill out the order of protection. He was served with papers. That paper worked like a charm. I was walking to a coffee shop one day. He was coming in the opposite direction. He saw me, turned around and went the other way. So when this was going on with my sister, I thought, this will be fine. He'll persist for a little bit. If it gets bad, we'll go to the police. You'll get the order of protection. He'll stop. It's not a big deal. But he didn't stop. Think about what I told you earlier, how stalking takes non-criminal behavior and criminalizes it. And this is what's going to happen to Peggy over the next year. He starts with phone calls. He starts calling her 20 times a day, 50 times a day. She's not answering, so he's going to text her. And the text messages and the phone calls were similar to their relationship. Hey, can you please pick up the phone? I just want to talk to you. Second message. I told you, pick up the phone when I call. Third message. You fucking bitch, pick up the phone or I'm going to fucking kill you. Fourth message. That last message was a little harsh. I didn't mean it. Maybe we can get together for coffee. And this went on and on and on. And Peggy's not engaging. She's not picking up her phone, and she's not answering the text messages. So he starts following her. And when Peggy moved out of the home they shared in, he did not know where she moved to. But he did know her yoga studio, her gym, her hair salon, so he knew kind of where he could find her. So he started following her, and again, Peggy is not engaging. At this point, she meets another guy. Peggy was working in pharmaceutical sales, and she meets this man, Mark, and begin dating. And Peggy says to Mark, I have a stalker. I'm going to be perfectly honest with you. If you want out, get out now. And Mark was like, I can totally handle this. So now Patrick finds out who Mark is and starts stalking Mark. And it's phone calls, and it's text messages, and it's following, and it's surveillance. And to this point, nothing really is happening. So Peggy is walking into work one day, and Patrick is hiding in the bushes, and he's got a dozen roses and a wedding ring. And he hops out and he says, I love you, will you marry me? And Peggy walks right by him. At this moment, is he sad because he lost the love of his life? What's he feeling? He's pissed. He is 100% angry. He didn't lose the love of his life. He lost power and control of the woman he had control over for 4 years. So because she's not engaging, he's going to turn up the heat. I said earlier, stalking behavior tends to escalate over time. And this is what he's doing. Because she's not answering her phone, and because she's not answering her text messages, and because she doesn't want to marry him, he makes a flyer. He takes Peggy's picture, he puts it on an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, and he writes on it, I'm a slut, I'm a bitch, I'm a whore. I've slept with several men and counting. I'd love to sleep with you. And he put Peggy's cell phone number on it. And he made about 300 copies and spread them all over the city of Albuquerque, New Mexico, specifically in places where he knew Peggy would see them. She walked into her yoga studio, and the instructor said, I hate to be the one to tell you this was taped to our front door. Peggy said, I've had enough. I'm going to police. So her and Mark go to the police with their phone records. So she's got calls, she's got text messages, now she's got a flyer. And the police tell her, I'm sorry, it's just a piece of paper. Come back to us when something happens. So they leave. And as they're leaving the police department and they get back on the freeway, Patrick begins following them, and he's got a gun in his car. And he's waving his gun, and he runs them off the road. They get off the freeway, they turn around, they go right back to the police department. Hey, we were just in here talking about this stalker. Now he's got a gun and he ran us off the road. Was anybody hurt? No. Well, come back to us when something happens. So we're going on about 5 months of this non-stop harassment. But no, nobody's injured, nobody's hurt. Come back to us when something happened is what Peggy was told by law enforcement. In June of 2002, my brother was getting married in Florida. And Patrick obviously knew about the wedding. And Patrick was very smart and set the stage. He called my brother and left him a voicemail and said, oh, I hope you and your wife have a wonderful wedding day. I'm so sorry that things between your sister and I didn't work out, and I really wish I could be there with you to celebrate. But I can't. But I wish you nothing but the best. So while our entire family is in Florida, Patrick gets on an airplane in Albuquerque and flies to Ohio and drives to my mother's house, and on white garage doors with black spray paint, he spray paints, PK is a whore. Those are Peggy's initials. My mother finds out about this while we're at the wedding, and they get a photo of it, and she files a police report. So now we have a police report in Poland, and we have, several reports that Peggy's filed out in Albuquerque. About 3 days after that, we're all out to dinner together in Florida, and nobody has their phone on them because Instagram didn't exist and nobody had to take pictures of their food. So we leave the restaurant and we grab our phones, and Mark has got 5 missed calls on his phone. Albuquerque police, Albuquerque fire, a neighbor, his mother. Someone had opened up a gas line and burned the back of Mark's house off. Peggy was like, it's Patrick. It's Patrick. She's talking to Albuquerque police, and they're telling her this is arson. And Peggy said, there is arson because I have a stalker. So Peggy and Mark go back to Albuquerque, and Peggy was even looking around the back of Mark's house where this gas line was open, saw the footprints in the mud, and said, these are the boots that I bought him for Christmas several years ago. This is the way he walks. If you go to his house, you'll find these boots. He was here. He's the one that opened up the gas line. I'm sorry, ma'am, this is an arson investigation. Let us handle it. Shut down again. So at this point, Peggy has had her fill. Now she's going to file stalking charges. She gets an attorney, files stalking charges, and is finally going to get an order of protection. She goes in and files for an order of protection, and Patrick catches wind of this and goes in and files for an order of protection against her. He tells the judge, she's a threat to me. She's violent, she uses drugs, she's an alcoholic, she scares me, she scares my young daughter. I don't want her anywhere near me. So in court, the judge tells the both of them, look, you stay away from her, you stay away from him. And they walk out of court, and Patrick looks over to Peggy and said, I told you not to fuck with me. He had done this before. He did it to his ex-wife. When his ex-wife filed for divorce and threw him out of the house, he began stalking her. There were 7 police reports in the city of Albuquerque Police Department that she had written. Criminal property damage. He came and cut all the glass windows on her home with a glass cutter. He went back one time with red oil-based paint and dumped it all over her home. The last police report she filed was the most terrifying to read, because on the back she had written, he's not going to be happy until he kills me or kills my young daughter. He is stalking me. Underline, underline, underline. Those 7 police reports were sitting in the Albuquerque Police Department. They knew exactly what they were dealing with, yet chose to look the other way. So while Peggy is awaiting trial, which she filed for stalking charges in August, the trial was pushed back to October, then pushed back again to January, which meant Patrick had several months to continue stalking her. So Mark and Peggy feel the best thing for her to do is pack up her apartment, move out to California, and stay out there until the stalking trial, because he's not going to find her out there. So that's exactly what they do. They pack up all her stuff and they move her into an apartment in Turlock, California. And for a while, Patrick wasn't having any luck finding her. But he began working with a private investigator. Private investigator didn't look into his background, didn't see that there was an order of protection out with his name on it. So Patrick wasn't paying him any money, so there was just kind of some back and forth email exchange about where Peggy might be. And he wasn't having very much luck with this direction. So he posed as a police officer. And he called Peggy's moving company and he said, I'm Officer Galuli. I've recovered some of Miss Klinke's stolen goods. Please give me her most current address so I can get them to her. And the woman at the moving company said, I'm sorry, officer, but I can't give out that information. That's confidential. But if you bring that stuff into our offices, we'll make sure to get them to her. And he says, you know what? Never mind. You don't need to tell her. And this girl thought, that's really odd for a police officer to admit that he's going to hold on to somebody's stolen goods. I should call Peggy. And so she called Peggy, and the first thing Peggy said is, I have a stalker. That's what this is all about. He's trying to figure out where I'm at. Don't give him any of my information. And I don't have anything that's been stolen. He's lying. His name's Patrick Kennedy. He's stalking me. So he hits a dead end there. He calls one of Peggy's coworkers. And thank God this girl played absolute dumb. She was like, I have no idea who she is. I've never heard of her before. And he said, okay, all right, never mind. So he was still working with a private investigator, and he was still posing as a private investigator, and wasn't making much headway. So around Thanksgiving, when we normally would all go home to Ohio, to my mother's house, Peggy flew in from California, but she went to Albuquerque. She was going to spend Thanksgiving out there. I had just put my girls to bed, the phone rang, I pick it up, and it's Patrick. I know where she's at, and in 2 minutes she'll be dead. My first thought is, oh my God, Patrick is probably standing in the backyard and he's going to open fire on my mother's house and kill me while I'm standing here on the phone. My second thought is, oh my God, he knows Peggy's in Albuquerque. He's probably standing outside of Mark's house and he's going to kill them both. So I call Albuquerque police and I stay on the phone with dispatch until I know that my sister's okay. And Peggy is freaking out when the police show up because she's thinking something's going on in Ohio. And at this point, I said, you know what, I'm filing a police report. That's a death threat phone call. He's telling me, that's Patrick telling me that he knows where you're at and he's going to kill you. Peggy said, please call the district attorney. He's not going to pick up. Please call him and leave him a message. So I do. I call him and explain to him how we got that phone call, and we don't know where Patrick is, and he's trying to find Peggy. He doesn't answer. Peggy calls the next day. And when the district attorney hears Peggy's voice, he starts laughing. And he goes, oh my God, you're still alive? This is how Peggy's being treated. He's laughing at her that she's still living. And Peggy said, is it going to take a bullet to my head for you to understand how serious this is? And that was the end of that conversation. 2 weeks after Thanksgiving, my mother receives a brown box filled with family photos that Peggy had left behind when she left Patrick. They were just in a Ziploc bag, some water poured in. Again, is that a crime? Nope. But we filed a police report because it was addressed to my mother. The return address was Mark, which we know Mark didn't send it because Mark didn't have access to those photos. But the most terrifying thing for me at that moment was the postmark on the box. It said San Jose, California, which meant he's getting closer to finding her. He was sending a very, very clear message to our family that he was eventually going to find Peggy. Peggy came home for Christmas. This is December of 2002. It was terrible. If you look at the picture that's up on the screen right now, she didn't look anything like this. Hair thinning, didn't eat very well, hypervigilant, wasn't comfortable being around us. I mean, she had 3 young nieces at the time and really couldn't do anything with them because what if she goes out and Patrick kills her and her 3 nieces? So it was a really, really terrible time. As much as we should have enjoyed her being home, it was awful for all of us. So when Peggy left my house, hugged her goodbye, and I was like, look, you've got 3 weeks till the stalking trial. 3 weeks, we're in the home stretch. Get back to California, get back to work, and the stalking trial will happen, and he'll be locked away. I was so wrong. I was so wrong in that mindset. I had put my full faith in the criminal justice system. I relied on them to protect her, and that's not what happened. On January 18th of 2003, on a Saturday morning, Peggy is out in California. We are in Ohio. I called her on my way to my mother's house. I was bringing my girls to my mother's house. We were celebrating my niece's 6th birthday. So everybody was like in toddler mode. I don't even know what the theme was that year, but we were getting ready to do all of that and brought my girls there, had dinner, put them to bed. Couldn't get a hold of Peggy, but it was no big deal. Like, you know, maybe she'll call us back. On that night, on that Saturday night, about 10 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Again, in my mother's neighborhood, most people don't ring the doorbell. You open the door and you say, hey, it's whoever it is, and you walk in the house. My first thought was, oh my God, I wonder if Patrick's standing on the front porch with a gun, and he's going to shoot whoever comes around the corner. So I carefully looked down the hallway, and I see 2 police officers standing on my mother's front porch. And I opened the door and said to them, just tell me, did Patrick Kennedy kill my sister? And the only thing I was told that night was that Patrick had found her and shot her and shot himself. That's all we knew. So how did he find her? Like I said, he was very good and very persistent. He was working with a private investigator, again, not paying him any money, but exchanging information via email. This private investigator gave him a road, something like 77, a road that had gone up the coast of California through many towns. So Patrick was going out there with a handgun, with a rifle, duct tape, rope, notebook, and business cards, saying that he was a private investigator. So he was out there casing neighborhoods. He made several trips. On January 17th of 2003, he hit the jackpot because he ran into a UPS driver. And Peggy being in pharmaceutical sales, he knew this was a direct line to finding her. So when he met this UPS driver, he said, look, I have a client. I just got to find this girl. He had a picture of Peggy with him. I just got to get this check from her. So if you could just give me her address, I can just go and get the check. And the UPS driver thought about it and was like, I probably shouldn't do it. And at the end of the day, he caved and called Patrick and said, this is where this girl lives. So on that Saturday morning, while we're in Ohio getting ready to celebrate a birthday party, Peggy is in her condo. She's got a basket of laundry. She sets it down on her kitchen counter. She opens up the garage door, and in walks Patrick. He had been hiding in there waiting for her. At this same time, Peggy was getting ready to go have coffee with a neighbor. And in walks Patrick. He's got a handgun. He beats her over the head with the gun, throws her up against the kitchen wall where she slides to the floor. He turns her on her back, he puts duct tape around her wrists, and then he duct tapes her mouth so no one's going to hear her scream. Peggy, little but mighty, was able to break free of that duct tape and pull the duct tape off her mouth. Do you want to come up? And we're not going to do this yet, but in a minute. She walks out her front door, and this poor woman, her neighbor Rachel, is waiting to go for coffee, and imagine the horror that this woman saw when Peggy opened up the door. She's covered in blood, screaming, "My stalker's here, he found me, he's going to kill me." So they run to Rachel's condo, they lock the door, they run upstairs and barricade themselves in the bedroom where Peggy's able to make a 911 call, and we're going to play that now.
911 emergency. I have a stalker and he's here to kill me. He's already beat me up and taped me. He's in my house. 1410, number 118. He's working dead. Who's there? Patrick Kennedy. He's beating me up with a gun. He's trying to break it down. Does he have a gun right now? He does. He already beat my head. If you don't get here, he's going to kill both of us. Okay, we're on the way, ma'am. Now. Are they on the way? They're on their way. Quickly. My head is stopping wet with blood. He is in this house. He's going to kill us. Stay on the line with me, ma'am. I'm staying on the line. Oh my God. How close are they? They're on stop it. I actually got to kill me. Ma'am?
So Peggy's able to make that 911 call as the SWAT team arrives. And Rachel's in the back of the closet, and Patrick has no knowledge of this, that she's there. And he's got Peggy to the ground with a gun to the back of her head, and there's an officer standing outside of the door, and he's trying to talk to Patrick. He's trying to engage Patrick, so Patrick takes his attention off Peggy. And Patrick is not having it. So Peggy, very calmly, she's not screaming, anything, very, very calmly, tells that officer outside of the door, please call my mother in Ohio, tell her I love her. He says, Peggy, let's not talk like that. Tell my sister who's pregnant to name her baby after me. Oh, and tell my niece who's been sick all winter, she's going to have a guardian angel watching over her. And shortly after that, Patrick sees Rachel in the closet, and for a second, he puts that gun down and tells her, get the hell out of here. So he releases Rachel. As soon as Rachel reaches the door, Patrick picks up the gun and tries to shoot the officer standing on the other side of the door. They pull Rachel out, they close the door. Patrick pulls the gun on Peggy, shoots Peggy in the head, turns the gun on himself, shoots himself. The officers go in, they pull Peggy out, they get her on the front yard. She dies several minutes later. Patrick dead at the scene. All the while that we're in Ohio, getting ready to celebrate a 6-year-old birthday party. And then we get the officers standing at my mother's front door. And I couldn't believe it. Like I said before, I had put full faith in our criminal justice system to protect her. How did this fail? How did this system fail her? This girl was hunted for a year. She did all the right things, checked all the boxes, put the order of protection in place, was awaiting a trial, had piles and piles of documents and paper, and still ends up dead. So in the week that we're planning Peggy's funeral, grief does a really weird thing to you. It can make you, God, it can make you so ugly. And it can make you hateful, and it can make you bitter. But that was not the road that I wanted to take. I just felt like there was something better that we could do with this. And at the time, I had no idea what that was. But I knew I didn't want to lose faith in humanity. I knew I didn't want to be a bitter person for the rest of my life because of this. And I kept questioning over and over again, how many Peggys are out there? How many victims lose their life at the hands of their stalker? And during that week, we were learning more and more about Peggy's story, talking to neighbors out there, talking to Rachel, elongating the story. My friend and I were talking and decided to contact the newspapers, not only in Turlock, California, where she was killed, but also in Albuquerque, because they were saying, oh, this is some guy that shot some girl. You got the story wrong. It's not some guy who shot some girl. It is a girl who was being stalked for a full year and still ended up dead. That's what the story is. And they ran 2 stories out in Turlock, California about Peggy, and they ran 1 story in Albuquerque. And the officer who was head of the domestic violence task force said, well, if it's a stalker, if they want you, they're going to find a way to get you. That's a very clear message to me that you're not going to do your job. How many people like you are out there that aren't protecting people like her? Things have to change. Again, I didn't know what it was at the time. But what I did find was that every time I was telling Peggy's story to somebody, it was almost like therapy for me. As tragic as it is, somehow, some way, it was like healing my heart. So about a month after Peggy was killed, and I was home, I had a kindergartner, I had a 2-year-old. A 2-year-old who was obsessed with Nick Jr. That's all she wanted to do was watch Blue's Clues every day. So she had walked out of the room, and I was like, oh, thank God. I need some kind of adult. Give me some news. Just give me anything that's not animated. So I turned on the Today Show, and on the screen was a woman talking about a successfully prosecuted stalking case up in Wisconsin, a woman who had been followed by using a GPS on her car. And her name was Tracy Baum. She worked for the Stalking Resource Center in Washington, D.C. I was like, oh my God, where were you when I needed you? Why did I not know about you? I go over to my AOL dial-up, and I sign on to my AOL account, and I write this really, really long email, everything that I knew about Peggy's case, and send it to her, thinking, she's in Washington, D.C. No one in Washington, D.C. is going to call me back. But the next day she did. And she asked me, Debbie, well, what do you want to see happen? And I kept going back to law enforcement. What if we had funding for every law enforcement agency to have a dedicated officer or officers to deal with stalking victims? What if we had something like that? They are usually the first contact with victims. What if they were trained in this, so people like Peggy wouldn't fall through the cracks? And she said, well, let me think on this, and I'll get back to you. And 2 days later, she called me and said, Lifetime Television called us. And Erin Brockovich is starting a new series called Ordinary Women, Extraordinary Lives. Would you like to tell Peggy's story? Absolutely. Because at this point, I would tell her story to anybody that would listen. So I got on the phone with the producers and basically relayed to them from the beginning of Peggy's stalking until the time she died. And they came back with, our team is so affected by your sister's story, we want to do something bigger. We want to go to Washington, D.C. We want to hold a congressional briefing. Would you be willing to go? Absolutely. So in July, just 6 months after Peggy was killed, Mark, her boyfriend at the time, and myself, along with Lifetime Television, Erin Brockovich, Mark Wynn, the National Center for Victims of Crime, and the Stalking Resource Center, all met in Washington, D.C. Heather Wilson, who was in the House of Representatives at the time, was there with us. And Mark and I both gave speeches at the congressional briefing. Heather Wilson stood on the House floor and asked for January to be declared National Stalking Awareness Month in honor of Peggy. And I had a great conversation with Heather while we were in DC. And again, I was saying, I just don't understand how this happened to her, and how many other people out there like her are losing their lives. What are we missing? And stalking is illegal. Stalking is a crime. It is in all 50 states. Maybe what we need is education. And I thought, that is where Peggy's story will live. That's what we're going to do with this. And out of that short trip to Washington, D.C., we decided to make a video for law enforcement called the Roll Call Tape, which is now the Roll Call CD, which is now Roll Call on YouTube. But if you go to YouTube and you Google Peggy Klinke, Erin Brockovich, stalking, you'll find it. It's a 17-minute training video specifically made for law enforcement. So when they come in on their shift and they have 15 to 20 minutes of time to learn something or to talk about what's going on, they can play that video. And in 17 minutes, they can learn about Peggy's story. They can also hear it from a law enforcement perspective. Mark Wynn is the second half of that video, who basically speaks to law enforcement about how to deal with stalking victims. So the beautiful thing about all of this was that Patrick wanted to wipe Peggy from this earth. He wanted to silence her. More people know Peggy today than when she was alive on earth. Peggy's story has touched so many lives. It has saved lives. I have worked with advocates and prosecutors and judges and law enforcement, and I hear continuously, your sister's story changed the way I deal with victims. I've heard from victims saying, your sister's story saved my life. So that's where Peggy's legacy lies, in education, in survivors, is to turning victims into survivors. And that's why I am so grateful to be here to deliver Peggy's story this evening. We're going to open up the floor with questions. I hope you have some good ones. And there's one that somebody asks every time I speak. It's the same question, and I'll be interested to see if anybody asks it tonight. Please ask questions. I know you got them.
If you have a, oh. If you, all right.
I'll come over to you.
All right, got to. All right, after that hearing with Congress and stuff, was there any backlash on the actual Albuquerque Police Department for their part in, neglect and?
There was no backlash on the Albuquerque Police Department, but what did change was that a new chief came in and cleaned out that department and had new officers come in. And I actually met an officer from Albuquerque when I was out in Oklahoma speaking, and he didn't work on Peggy's case. He was on the force at the time. And he was like, I am so sorry for what happened to your sister, but we do things differently. Any questions about her case? Here's one over here. I'll just go over. I can win. Go ahead. Stand up, just so we can hear you.
Well, I don't know if this is just me being ignorant, but in the 911 call, she just sounded very calm. I didn't expect that.
I didn't either.
She wasn't screaming. She just.
Mm-mm.
And I guess I have another one. Did you ever hear back from like the district attorney?
Okay, so she asked me if I ever heard back from the district attorney. He died. He died, I don't know how many years ago, but no, I mean, we never heard from anybody from Albuquerque. Nobody has ever reached out to us.
Do you kind of want to address the calmness of her voice too?
She had said she was surprised by the calmness of Peggy's voice in the 911 call. And I mean, I guess I am too, but like I said, when she was able to deliver those messages to that law enforcement agent, she was extremely calm. So maybe she was grateful that this was ending. It was always my thought. Yes?
Has anyone had any contact with Patrick's daughter, who is also a victim?
Her question was, has anybody had any contact with Patrick's daughter, who is also a victim? No, never. Yes?
Did Patrick kill his ex-wife too?
No, he asked if Patrick killed his ex-wife. No, he did not. When I said about that police report where she wrote that she was worried that he was going to kill his daughter, the stalking actually stopped after that police report was written because he met Peggy. Yeah. So as far as I know, his ex-wife is still alive. Yes?
I guess I'm wondering how he had any possession of his daughter after he threatened her and his ex-wife. How was he still having this little girl?
So she was asking me about the custody of the little girl with his ex-wife. So they had joint custody. But then when the order of protection was in place, they had said, we're going to give you a psychiatric evaluation. And he said, you're not evaluating me. I give up my rights. So he lost rights with his daughter at that point. Yeah, after the order of protection was put in place.
Where would people go in this area if they feel they're being stalked? To the police?
Do you want to answer that? Where would people go in this area if you were stalked?
Yeah, so specifically I'm going to address Walsh University first because we have a lot of students We have both confidential resources as well as formal reporting options. So the two formal reporting options we have are campus police, and I'm gonna give a little plug to them. Their number is not just 911 here. If you are a student, faculty, or staff here, campus police's number is 330-490-7474. That is the quickest way to get a hold of our campus police. Okay. The second formal reporting option is our Title IX coordinator. Christy, can you raise your hand? Okay. This is where you would go through the university, okay, and you can go through the formal process with her. Confidential resources, Maura, you can stand up. Maura is our confidential victim advocate, works for the local Red Crisis Center. We have Francie Morrow, counseling services here on campus. We also have, we've been representing campus ministry, but Father, not Ben, but Father Louis Bertrand is a confidential resource for folks. And who am I missing? No, we're done. Health services across the street too. If you are out in the community, 911. We also have our local domestic violence shelter. I don't know if they're here tonight. We have a representative, but Domestic Violence Project Incorporated. As in Peggy's story, there was a connection between an intimate partner. Oftentimes we do see that, and there are good first step if there's that connection. Anyone from the CCR team want to speak up if I'm missing anything? Okay.
Yes.
Interstate or whatever. So it would seem she had a protection of abuse order in Arizona. What happened when she went to California? Because it would seem that how do you advocate for somebody
So
who
here's
has
the
a partner in one state and you're in another state?
So here's the one thing about Peggy's order of protection. It was never entered into the database. So when she moved to Turlock, California, they wanted her to refile, which would have put her most current address on it. Yes. And she said, I'm not doing it. But if you listen to people like Mark Wynn talk about these stalking cases, and he will say in the training video, we know that victims move from state to state. So the stalkers will move from state, and we need to be, law enforcement, we need to be on top of that. We need to talk across county lines and state lines, because there was also 2 different counties in New Mexico.
Wow.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, how do you protect somebody if
Yeah.
you're stamping them out with their current address?
Yeah, well, that's why she said, I'm not doing it. But her order was not in a database. I couldn't pull it up. Yes?
How do you help a victim get past their fear of their stalker and stop communicating with them?
How do you get a victim over the fear of their stalker and stop communicating with them?
Yes. When the stalker calls or texts, how do you get them to stop responding back out of fear?
Well, and that's the tricky situation, because remember I said sometimes they will stay close to feel safe and keep that balance in check. I don't know, unless you want to offer anything professional about handling.
Yeah, of course. I can share from my standpoint, and then I'll also toss it over to some of our advocates. So first, victims and survivors have to be ready to go forward to get help to leave the situation. And it can be the most frustrating thing being a loved one watching that, but they absolutely have to be ready to do that. One thing I do want to mention, second, getting the cue to use this. So another thing I want to mention, when there's intimate partner violence involved, again, going through the domestic violence shelter, when you connect with an advocate through their 24-hour hotline, they're able to do something called a lethality assessment. And a lethality assessment is where they kind of go through a series of questions and they determine what things are present in your particular case that would make you more likely to experience lethality, unfortunately. That's based off of some research by Dr. Rebecca Campbell, or Jacqueline Campbell actually, in the field. But let me go to the advocates too, for those who trained in advocacy.
I think the one thing I would add is that we also have to trust victims and their instincts. And so from our standpoint, yes, we want them to stop communicating, we want them to not have any contact, walk away from it. But sometimes for the victim, that their instinct always being scared behind your shoulder. And so I think it's important to tell them the benefits of not having that communication, but also giving them that choice and trusting them that they have to make that decision on their safety, if it's going to be cutting off all ties or not. And we might not agree with it, but they have to do what they're ready for in that moment.
Sorry, I just got reminded by Ron Springer, one of our campus police captains, who just went through extensive stalking training, that if you go to Spark's website, if you type in Spark stalking online, they actually have a stalking risk assessment as well online that anybody can take. It's free, and it goes into really detailed questions about what is happening in that particular situation. It can also provide awareness if a victim can go through that list and see objectively how it's being ranked in terms of risk. It can help them also process through what objectively is happening in their situation.
Thank you.
And we have a Spark resource too at our tables out here if anyone's interested.
Go ahead. Yeah.
What advice do you have for us as young people today trying to meet people, make friends, in romantic relationships? Like, what advice do you give to us as the youth trying to...
That would be more to you.
Oh gosh, what advice? Look for the red flags. Trust your gut. She shared it before, but honestly, when you're looking at these situations, it doesn't just escalate all of a sudden to a homicide situation. There are almost always red flags that were present along the course. So possessiveness. She spoke a lot about power and control, really teasing apart what people are doing. Is there a profound jealousy in the relationship? And when you see those red flags, trusting your gut, right? And knowing that you can always say no in that situation. That would be one thing that I would share. Anyone from our CCRT, Coordinated Community Response Team? No, that's about it? Like I said, all right.
But a lot of times, these are young girls with not a whole lot of experience. So this red flag, I personally was in an experience where I was flattered by all the attention I was getting. Oh, he must really like me. It took a long time before and so hindsight is 20/20. In the meantime, are there things that we could do to tell our daughters to look out for?
I have 3 daughters. I'm thinking, so in the work that I do, and it's at a very collegiate level, at college on up, we're finding out we need to have healthy relationship conversations with younger and younger people.
Absolutely.
What is a healthy relationship? I talked about how the media and music and Hollywood portray stalking as romantic, so these kids are getting this message. So that's why we have to get into this younger population and tell them, literally tell them, this is what a healthy relationship is, this is what it isn't. I've had girls in high school when I'm talking about stalking, and he wants to know, where are you at? When are you going to be home? What are you doing? Who are you with? Take a picture. Let me see where you're at. And the girls are like, no, you want that attention from your boyfriend. And we're like, no, that is not a healthy relationship. Yeah. So that's where I think we have to get in and have conversations with these younger kids.
I mean, they've taken away like health in schools, high school health, and those kind of things, home economics, those kind of things that used to touch on relationships. And it's no longer a requirement in Ohio in high schools.
Okay.
And it's like, so that we're missing that point of saying those kind of things.
Yeah.
Because like I said, I was very flattered.
And
very
phones.
Flattered. We
have phones. So you imagine the amount of information that these kids have access to that we didn't have access to 30 years ago.
Amazing.
And they can keep in contact with each other 24/7.
And they do.
And they do.
Just to add to that real quick, Ohio actually does have a law that requires a dating violence prevention curriculum for grades 7 through 12 as well. So that is something that was passed in 2008, 2009. It was enacted. So that's something important. But also, I'm getting reminded of my job again by he told me, tell them about bystander identify red flags on their own, right, is all of us have a responsibility for knowing warning signs of stalking, sexual assault, domestic dating violence, and it's our job to disrupt those harmful red flags when we see them. Call it out, tell a friend, hey, that to me looks like this. Important. Don't say, that guy's a loser. Say, hey, what I'm concerned about is how that guy seems to be really possessive of you. Or that girl seems to be not letting up on the phone calls, or she's creating fake accounts. That's a little bit sketchy. So just important to be a bystander. Oh,
I just wanted to add something, just like going back to that question. I do think it's also important for us to continue to have conversations like this. This is multi-generational. There's people from just about every generation sitting in this room. And so being able to take that back and have conversations with your peers. So I think about, like, I'm middle-aged, and there's some of those same harmful ideologies when it comes to dating were present. So I have a responsibility to go to those that are in my age group and say, like, no, that's harmful, you know, and then hoping that they will take that, and when they're having their conversations with their son and daughters, that they'll do that. But then also the responsibility for all of our students, like, as a peer, you have power, and being able to go to your peers and being able to say, like, this isn't it, or just offer a different perspective, even though ultimately they're going to make whatever, you know, decision that they feel is best for them. But putting it out there and just not being silent, and I think that's the biggest thing. Like, even if you just tell one person and it makes a difference, it's the impact that we would want.
Anybody else? Yes.
How does the law define stalking in terms of effective arrests or prevention? It seems like it's still wait till something happens before anything can happen.
Depending on the jurisdiction. That's what I see. It's like it's 2 times and it's stalking, and they'll call it in. But other jurisdictions seem to.
So jurisdiction to jurisdiction, state to state, it's
Yeah.
all different.
Yeah. I mean, I've worked with law enforcement that, like up in Connecticut, Stalk the Stalker programs. They do wonderful programming and training their officers, so the officers know what to look for, so they can pull that offender in for stalking. But there are other jurisdictions where, like, that doesn't happen here. That's not a big deal. I'm 100% convinced that had Peggy been stalked in a different jurisdiction, she'd be alive today.
So it's not a federal crime, it's just a civil?
No, it's a federal crime. But it just depends on the jurisdiction and how seriously they're going to take it. Am I right about that? It's a federal crime. And
every state has their own revised code that goes with the actual crime itself. And then each individual jurisdiction inside that state, you may have one prosecutor or district attorney that's real aggressive in proceeding with those cases, or you might have somebody else who's really not. The law's there, it's written. It's local law enforcement to take it in and present that case.
yeah. Yes.
On the stalking incident log you had, so does that have to be backed up by proof, or are they just to take your word for it?
I mean, if you have a phone and you're taking pictures of the person that's driving by your house,
But let's say you're getting texts all the time, and going back to you are still talking to your stalker, but the texts are not their texts, and you delete them because you don't want anyone to see them, but you're telling people, your family, your parents about them. You put them on the log. Do you have to have proof, or are they going to take your word for it?
I mean, depending on where you go. Peggy had proof and they didn't care.
Yeah.
But one thing that we do tell students, especially with phones, don't delete any of that stuff. That is proof. If you've got direct messages, if you've got text message, if you have photos, all of that is proof. Don't voicemails. He's called and threatened to kill you.
And it goes back to if you still are talking and fear him, then you delete those messages.
Right. But one thing that we try to hit home is, please try and save that. Yes.
This was several years ago. I don't know what the situation is right now, but I know many years ago I did have to contact Verizon, and I think I paid a fee, but they printed the whole shit show of texts I was receiving from somebody. So whether they were, and I don't recall on my phone, I probably hadn't deleted them And I don't know if you do delete them, does that go away from the Verizon, you know, universe of what data they have? But I do know you can have, you know, hard copy proof of those messages if you contact your phone.
Yeah, because that stuff, even though it's off your phone, it still exists somewhere.
So
Yeah.
there are ways.
There's ways to find it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You can
Yeah.
block a caller, and all that stuff still won't be there.
Yes.
I mean,
Oh,
I've
yeah.
done it, it's still there. I also picture frame. You take pictures. I've printed them out at big box stores and kept them in a folder. But my township in Pennsylvania, the police basically, this individual was contacting not just myself but my son, because I blocked the phone. Then he contacted me from another phone, and then told my son he was gonna come mess up my car, do property damage. Just somebody that worked on my house, so I couldn't even get a PFA against him. But the township was basically like, well, we can't do anything unless he comes on your property. And I said, well, how about harassment charges? We'll go that angle. It won't get prosecuted.
Yeah. Yes.
Whatever resulted from the arson investigation, was he ever?
Oh, whatever resulted in the arson investigation, I want to puke when I say this. They never found out who did it. Yeah, I mean, Peggy was in their hair and they wanted nothing to do with her. They didn't want to hear anything that she had to say. So I think it was inconclusive. They weren't sure who did it.
Debbie, probably one more question that we'll take tonight, just to be mindful of everyone's
Okay.
time. However, I know there's lots of questions in the room because I see hands still popping up. Debbie did say that she would stay for a little bit at the end here to answer kind of individual questions.
I'll hang out.
To hang out. And so go ahead with the last.
Who was the last one? Someone? Yes. I'm going to come over here.
First thing that I wanted to touch on when I heard the 911 call.
Yes.
Was not necessarily calm. It was somebody that was ready. She knew how to react in a panicked situation the way we should react to relay information that is detrimental.
Right.
That's what I heard. And secondly, I wondered if you can tell the progress of Spark now and different police stations and things that might be helping. Can you see that in statistical data as far as?
I can't see it, but Spark can probably see it. I can say, I don't know if this is what you're looking for, from where we were 20 years ago to where we are now, we have come leaps and bounds, especially with, like I said, the education and the activism and events like this didn't exist 20 years ago. Nobody was talking about it. So we have come a long way, but we also know, because we're still losing victims, that we have an awful lot of work to do. Are we good? All right. Yes. Thank you, everybody. I will hang for a bit.
Thank you, everyone, for being here this evening. This was a phenomenal crowd here tonight. Really appreciate you.